Hi there. I want to show you a simple way to build mold boxes and to cast pieces in what's called an open-faced mold. Open-faced molds are one-sided molds where the resin is poured in and then one side is left open to the world around it. And generally, this type of casting is really good for simple pieces that don't have a lot of undercuts. And ones that usually have one flat side that you don't really care about. This right here is the mold for the the master mold for the rocky outcroppings insert bases. So here, once I fill this with resin, if I fill it up level, then I can either scrape the top of it or put something over the top of it or just fill it just enough so that it's full. And then once the resin cures, I can pull those pieces out and then I have the fully formed pieces. This type of open-faced mold is really useful for a variety of terrain applications and for what I think is one of the best first kind of entrees into casting, and that is making your own custom resin bases. So this is a set of bases that I started working on for an Eldar army that I'm planning on doing here in the future. And I wanted some pieces that were kind of had like a hexagonal kind of ruined pavement kind of design. So with these, doing an open face mold is perfect because I don't really care what the underside of the base looks like. I only care about what the top of the base looks like. If you want other examples of bases done this way, the maggot bases on my previous Kickstarter are a good example. And actually the very first thing that I ever cast were the forest bases for my Wood Elf army. This was probably like 6 or so or 7 years ago that I cast using this technique as well. So the techniques I'm about to show you are a great way to get started into casting, and it's a great way to end up with a really kind of interesting set of bases, so that if you go through and sculpt some different base sizes for what you might need for your army, you can then go and cast them and then come up with resin duplicates of them, where you can have a really unique basing for your army and learn casting to boot. So the technique for building a mold box that I'm going to show you is using foam core, which is a material that you can get that has about looks like about 1/8 of an inch of foam that has paper on either sides of it. The foam core that I use is this kind of black papered foam core that I get from a store called the Dollar Tree. And one of the benefits of it is that it's cheap. It costs $1 for a large kind of poster board size sheet of it. But also another benefit is that they use really cheap glue to adhere the paper to the foam. So that for things that I'm using that I need some sort of foam to carve or that kind of thing, then this is perfect because I just peel the paper off of it and then it makes for a nice piece of foam to carve in that's nice and thin. So what I'm going to be casting today are some initial pieces for a set of objective markers that I'm making for a large tournament here in the Pacific Northwest that's coming up in September. It's called the Ordo Fanaticus Club Challenge. The pieces that I've made here are less important than the technique I'm about to show you. If it matters, then these pieces are really rough cut ones that I'm actually going to cast, make a mold of, and then cast in plaster. And then I'm going to use those plaster casts from this to go through and carve and sculpt and add all the detail to start off. In order to build a mold box, the first thing that you need to do is to adhere the pieces that you want to cast to some sort of a base. Here I'm using a piece of that same foam core that I described. And the way that I adhered them in this case was just using Elmer's glue, Elmer's glue wall. Eventually though, for things like bases and those sorts of things that I've done, what I've used is hot glue in that case. Hot glue is nice because it dries quickly, it's not something that you have to wait overnight for it to dry well, and that it's easily removable. So for instance with these bases, I filled the back of them with hot glue and then pressed them down into the base of the mold box before I built the mold. In addition to the piece that I'm using here for to glue the models to, I've also got these 4 pieces that I've cut off, and here these are just random offcuts that I've used that I'll use to build the actual walls of the mold. A good hot glue gun is necessary for this. I wouldn't necessarily describe this as a good hot glue gun, but it is one of those dual temperature hot glue guns, and it's always important that what we're wanting to deal with whenever we're doing any kind of this casting sort of thing is we want it on the high temperature hot glue. The low temperature doesn't stay hot enough, it doesn't stay liquid long enough for us to be able to do what we need to do with it. So make sure whatever type of hot glue gun you're using, it's a high temperature hot glue gun. To lay the first wall down, I'm going to lay a bead of hot glue along the edge of the first wall piece. And I'm going to put it on a nice even bead so that when I go through and put it down here, I'm going to try to put it about so that the top ends about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to try to make it so I keep that 1/8 inch gap all the way around everything that I have. Once that first piece is done, then I kind of want to move quickly, and I want to go through and add glue to the next piece, and then I'm basically going to create overlapping pieces here, where I'm adhering one piece to the piece next to it and to the base, and trying to hold that 90 degrees. And then I'm going to do it with the longer piece. These are just random offcuts that I'm using for this. You know, cutting things more to size is usually a good idea. And this is another reason why hot glue is useful, is because that lower temperature melt glue would harden too quickly for me to be able to use it. So then I'm going to adhere this to there. In cases like that, where the glue pushes a little bit closely to what I'm looking for, or a little bit too closely to the model, I might go through and while it's still warm, kind of scrape it with something to push it out of the way. With this model, it doesn't matter so much, because what I'm using this for is to create some plaster casts of these new objective markers that I'm actually then going to carve and sculpt and finalize, and then I'll be using those to cast the resin ones. So what I'm casting here are just rough pieces that I'm going to make plaster casts of, and then carve the plaster to make the final models. And then if you've done it so that, see how it's overlapping here and here, then if I've set things up correctly, then when I get to the last one, it should be pretty easy to close like that. So I'm going to start by running a bead of glue down the mold box that I'm working on, and then end up doing the same thing that I did to the other walls to this wall. And then I can just push that into place there. So one thing that I am doing is I'm pushing these pieces against the walls. I'm pushing each of the wall pieces against the other walls to try to make a firm seal. If I want to, and I've gotten to the point where I don't really have to worry about it too much, but if I want to be extra certain of the seams that I'm making, I could go along the outside and just run a bead of hot glue along those edges, along all of the seams. What we're trying to do is to make this watertight, and it doesn't actually have to be perfectly watertight because the mold material we'll be using is thicker than water. But the more watertight this is, the better. And then again here with the last piece, I'm just going to run a bead of glue down there. Okay. Oops, one more side we missed. So again, going through and running that extra glue around the outside edges, along the kind of cracks there, isn't necessary, but it's something that helps. If you're not experienced at it and you want to make sure that you have a nice tight thing, a nice tight mold box, then you could do that to make certain. Once you've created your mold box, you need a few other supplies. I tend to like to spray everything with a mold release, and I use Man Ease Release 200. You can get this from Smooth On or Tap Plastics or any other number of casting suppliers. I don't necessarily need this depending on the type of model that I'm using, but I kind of use it out of force of habit. You can also get away with a pair of gloves. A lot of people, and me when I first started casting, I didn't wear any rubber gloves, but wearing rubber gloves just makes cleanup so much easier, and prevents exposure to any kind of potentially harmful chemicals over long periods of time. So in order to create molds, you need some sort of silicone rubber compound in order to be able to create your molds. What I've got here is Mold Max 14NV, which is my silicone mold material of choice. It's from a company called Smooth-On. Smooth-On has a great online website with tons of great products, and they also have lots of regional distributors, so you can buy it locally instead of ordering if you need to. There are two main types of silicone rubber you can use: platinum cure silicone and tin cure silicone. When I first started, I used platinum cure silicone almost exclusively. Platinum cure silicone is more expensive than tin cure silicone by about twice as much, and it is a lot more fluid, so that means it picks up detail a lot better. It can stretch a lot more before it tears, and those are all good things about it, except for the price, of course. On the downside, the platinum cure silicone tends to react poorly to a wide variety of materials. So you have to be really careful what you're casting with platinum cure silicone. I actually have some pieces of acrylic that I use to create the mold walls because the paper that would be on the foam core has the potential to be able to react negatively with platinum cure silicone. Tin cure silicone, on the other hand, which is what Mold Max 14NV is, tends to be a lot less expensive. It tends to care a lot less about what other materials you use it with, so I can use it with paper-sided foam core mold boxes without any sort of concerns whatsoever. But on the downside, it tends to be a lot more thick, a lot more viscous. And as such, when folks use that sort of tin cure silicone, what they're usually doing is using a vacuum chamber with things. This is one of the molds from Castle Molds or Hearst Arts. And this is made of, you can tell because of how thick it is and how it's not quite as stretchy, this is made of a tin cure silicone. With that said, Bruce Hearst creates some of the highest quality molds I've ever seen, and I can't recommend his products enough for folks wanting to build things, build pieces of terrain that they could use his molds for. A fantastic product and well worth it. Tin cure silicones, this is a mold that I made in order to be able to cast some windows and doors that I used for some buildings I've been working on. Has the benefit of being much less expensive. It's a good thing in that case, and it also can take a lot more materials in it. For example, this is made of, the masters here were made of a variety of sculpting materials, woods, plastic hard, cast in a paper, in a foam core mold box. None of that impeded the curing of the mold material, so it was all great. The downside of this sort of mold material, though, is that it tends to be a lot more viscous. It tends to be able to, when you mix things up, it tends to capture bubbles a lot more, so you have to be really careful. One way that you can combat bubbles is to go through and use a vacuum chamber to suck all the air out of it, and it would foam up and it would suck all the bubbles and air out of the material. However, that can get expensive to have a vacuum chamber. So to reiterate, platinum silicone is very fluid, and you don't need to degas it with a vacuum chamber before you use it. Tin cure silicone, you usually do need to degas with a vacuum chamber because it can collect bubbles otherwise that can ruin the detail of your models. Mold Max 14NV is neat because it is a tin cure silicone rubber, but it's specifically formulated to have a low viscosity, so that it means that you don't have to vacuum it before you pour it. The NV in 14NV stands for no vacuum. Mold Max 14NV has become my mold material of choice because it's inexpensive, because it doesn't require vacuuming, and it still picks up really, really good detail without having to vacuum it. It's a white color. It consists of two parts. There's a part A that is a thick white material, and there is also a part B that is a thin, kind of clear, watery material. With many types of silicone, you can mix them in equal weights or equal volumes, and that will, so you mix an equal amount of part A with part B, and that will give you all the materials mixed together that you need to cure. With the MoldMax 14NV, it's set up to be a basically 10-to-1 ratio, so by weight, not by volume. So for every 10 ounces of MoldMax 14NV part A I use, I want to use 1 ounce in weight of part B to mix together. To create the mold, I want to pour a total of 10 parts of part A by weight. So I'm using here a scale, and I'm going to put in right there, ooh, a little too much. That'll be okay. I put in a total of 3.1 ounces of part A, which means that I'd want 0.3 ounces, oh, it just went up to 0.32 ounces of part B. I better go ahead and pour a little bit of that out then, because I actually want to make my math easy. So this should be a total of 3 ounces of part A that I want to use for my mold material. That means I'll need 0.3 ounces of part B. To pour part B, I'm going to use a different cup, and I'm going to go ahead and re-zero my scale so that it is ready to go again. And I want to pour in 0.3 ounces of this. Perfect. Not perfect. Pouring a little bit back there. Pouring a little more back. Pouring a little more back. Perfect. So I've got 10 parts by weight of part A, and into that I'm going to mix 1 part of weight by part B. I'm going to pour those together, and I'm going to mix them. The 14NV is such that it doesn't actually have any kind of color coding. A lot of the mold materials that you'll see have things where one part will be one color, another part will be another color, and you're supposed to mix them together until the color is of an even consistency. Because part B in this case is clear, it won't really change the color on things. So I'm going to mix this for probably about a good 2 or 3 minutes. As I'm mixing, I'm going to want to make sure that I scrape the sides really well. A lot of places suggest that you mix the two materials together in a third cup rather than using 1 cup to be able to do things in, and that's largely because of it being difficult to make sure that you have everything mixed together. The scale that I used was a simple baking scale. My wife and I actually got that for when we got married, and had planned to use it a lot more for baking. Never used it, and it wasn't until a good, 10 or so years later that I rediscovered it and realized that it's just the thing for weighing materials when casting. Okay, so I've got my mold material nice and mixed up, and I've got you can see it's kind of like a thin batter in consistency. And I've got my mold box ready to go. The other thing that I want to be able to use is some sort of disposable brush. Disposable because it's going to get ruined when it gets silicone in it. But I want to be able to use some sort of brush to be able to make sure that I can get all of the mold material into all the different details that I'm looking for on the models that I'm using. I use really cheap what are called acid brushes that you can get from any hardware store. I get mine from Harbor Freight, because you can get large amounts of them pretty cheaply. If you do get the cheap ones, or even if you get the nice ones, just to be safe, one good thing to do ahead of time is to go through and kind of rough up some of the, and try to pull at some of the bristles, just so that bristles don't go loose inside of the mold box once you start molding things. So to do this, to pour the mold, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that everything's nice and mixed up with the mold material, and I'm going to pour in just a glob to start with. I don't want to fill the mold box yet. I just want to pour in enough mold material that I can go through with a brush and make sure that I do a nice job of coating all of the surfaces of the model that I am wanting to mold. So what I'm doing, you can stipple if you want to in order to be able to make sure that it gets in all the nooks and crannies, but I've found that if you just make sure that you brush over everything, then you'll end up with a nice, smooth, bubble-free layer that's close to the model itself, and that will prevent there from being any bubbles in the casting. All right, good. So I've done that now, and then really the next thing to do is just to pour in the rest of the mold material. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. Some people recommend a really long pour because it helps stretch out the mold material more and makes you less likely to capture bubbles in it. Since I won't be using this mold to do pressure casting or anything like that, the only bubbles that I'm concerned about are the ones that are right against the model itself, and really the brushing kind of took care of that. So I can be kind of rough with this and just kind of dump it out. Once I've got the mold material completely covering the models and kind of go an extra maybe 1/16 of an inch or so above that, then I can let this sit. You can see there's some bubbles in there right now. Those bubbles will continue to release given how low viscosity the mold material is. But I'm going to find a nice level place to put this, and in about 4 hours this mold material will be ready will be fully cured and will be ready to pull out. So this is a simple process that you can use to create a really basic open-faced mold. In further videos, I'll be showing you how to demold this and how to be able to do resin casting out of it.